Yeah, congratulations. All right, I'm getting the high sign. So are we good now, Donnie? We can get going?
Yeah, you can go now.
All right, thank you. Call the meeting to order. Let the record show that this is a joint council workshop with the town of Fort Mill and the city of Tega Cay. The press has been duly notified, and both councils have a quorum present. Although no votes will be taken today, it's just for the record. Would everyone please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please remain standing for a moment of silence. Thank you very much. Before we get started, I'd like to have some introductions. The person immediately to my right is the mayor of Fort Mill, Gwen Savage. And at this time, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Gwen so she can introduce her council.
Thank you. And we really appreciate the fact that Tega Cay and Fort Mill have begun migrating to a place and time that we're able to leverage the intellect and the opportunity to work together. So I'm very, very happy for Georgia's relationship and your councils and your community's support. So thank you so much as we work hard for you. Down at the end, Larry, could you raise your hand? This is Larry Huntley. He is also our Mayor Pro Tem. This is Lisa McCarley, and this is Ronnie Helms. Two of our members are out of town and couldn't be here, and hopefully with the very pitiful voting in Fort Mill, we will have a new candidate to fill a seat next Monday night, so we'll have a full council. So thank you so much for having us today.
Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about how this all came about. I was in a meeting with a member of the Home Builders Association, and he started talking to me about economic growth, and I thought how great that would be for council to hear the whole presentation about economic growth and what it means to our community. I left that meeting and I called Mayor Savage and I asked her if she wanted to participate. She agreed, and she got her council on board, and we got our council on board. So that's the reason why we're all here today. We hear a lot of things about the economy. We hear a lot of things about growth. I thought it would be nice if we heard from somebody who is in every day and is involved in it every day and has spoke on the issue several times. With that being said, this gentleman has come to speak with us. He has a fee of $2,500, which is his stipend that he collects. I was not willing to give up $2,500 of taxpayer dollars. The town of Fort Mill agreed. The Home Builders Association is paying his stipend so that they can educate us on what is happening here in our community and in our area. So I just want to clear that up as to where the stipend comes from. The gentleman who is going to speak to us today is Dr. Joey Von Essen. He is an economist, and he is a research economist in the Division of Research at the Moore Business School, where he conducts economic impact analysis, forecasts, survey researches, and other work involving the economy. Dr. Von Essen also specializes in housing economics and residential real estate and provides economic and marketing research clients in both the private and public sector. He regularly speaks to businesses and government leaders throughout the state of South Carolina. So at this point, I'd like to ask him to come to the podium and make your presentation.
Okay, if I speak here, is this okay? Can everybody hear me all right?
You're good.
Okay, good deal. All right, well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much to the council and to everyone here for inviting me to participate and to present to you this evening. My name is Joey Von Essen, and I am a research economist with the Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. And we do a wide variety of applied economic research in our division of research, or what I like to call as a shorthand, so what economics, meaning we look at the data and we ask the question, so what? How do these data apply? And our goal, whether we're working with a business, whether we're working with a nonprofit, whether we're working with a government agency, is always to provide strategic information to help them to make good, informative decisions. And to that end, we are not a policy institute. Our goal is to provide objective information, again, to help different entities and institutions make strategic decisions. And I think that's important to say up front, because when I go through my talk tonight and go through construction and its contributions to local economies, I want to be very clear that I'm not going to be providing any policy recommendations or any conclusions. My goal here tonight is to provide information for you as you go through these different policy discussions and to help you make an informed decision. But my talk is going to be an overview of, again, of local economies and the contribution that construction has, but I'm not going to provide any specific recommendations. Again, the idea is to provide specific actionable information that you can use to help make those decisions. So I just want to make that point up front before we get started. So to that end, briefly, let's go through an outline of where we're going to be going over the next few minutes, and I will be going through each of these points in succession, and then I'm going to talk for about half an hour or so, maybe a little bit longer, and then we can have our Q&A session at the end. But I think just in terms of logistics, it might be helpful if I go through the entire presentation first, and then we open it up to questions in that order. So the outline for this evening, I want to start out by talking about housing markets in general from a macro perspective and their contributions and to the U.S. economy and to local economies as well, and talk about it from a macro perspective. Again, housing markets and their general relationship to economic growth. What does that look like? What does that mean? We know that housing markets are important, but how do we put specific numbers on it? And how do we begin to think about quantifying what the impact of construction is? Then point number two, we'll talk about South Carolina's housing markets, especially in context with the growth that we've seen over the last 6 years since the Great Recession. And I want to specifically put in context how housing markets are growing today throughout South Carolina and why that's the case, and how housing markets within South Carolina have responded to a more general increase in economic activity and overall demand, and how that is manifesting itself in terms of housing market demand in 2015 and into 2016 so far. So that'll be point number two. And then point number three, I want to go through some local economic trends, talk about some specific indicators as we look at local housing markets within South Carolina, and then finally wrap up by talking about future sources of growth and how we can begin to think about that and analyze that going forward. So that's really the outline of my remarks this evening. So starting out, let's think through a little bit about how we can understand housing's contribution to the U.S. economy. In a very macro sense, so looking from a very high-level view, housing markets in general, the housing market tends to contribute historically in excess of 15% overall to GDP, to gross domestic product. So if we look at the aggregate economy overall, housing typically constitutes at least, at minimum, 15% of overall GDP, and that is a significant percentage. Housing is one of the larger industries, one of the larger contributors to GDP overall, and we can break that down specifically. So 15% is the number that we typically look at historically as a minimum there. And so the question is, where does that come from? And it comes from two primary sources. We typically look at construction itself, or what we call the bricks and sticks, so the actual construction, the construction itself, but also all the housing-related services that are wrapped up around that. So when we talk about construction, that's usually about 5% of overall GDP. And again, typically that's the actual construction and some related services that are intimately connected to construction. So brokerage fees, for example, in those markets. But also then housing-related services, and that's everything from interior decorating to insurance to all of these other related services that are additional components when people buy a house or people are remodeling. All of the housing-related services. And there are a number that we can list, but when we aggregate those up, we see about another 10 to 12% overall of GDP. So it's a combination both of construction itself as well as all the housing-related services, and that's how we get to that 15% number, and that's what we track back historically and what it looks like there. So these are some numbers that we can look back and just see how that number has actually changed. So historically, in terms of both of these components going into GDP. What does housing look like historically? So tracking back to 1980 here, you can see about 17.9%. I don't have every year listed, but this is just to give you a trend. Over time, so through 2005, you can see around 18.6%, and then a really major drop-off beginning in 2010 down to about 15%. And that's not unexpected, of course, because of the Great Recession and really the housing crisis that we're all familiar with. That had real effects. And when we talk about a 3 percentage point difference here in the contribution of housing markets to the U.S. economy, and that change in that shorter period of time, that's rather dramatic. So we see these real effects of the Great Recession on the national economy. And we all know, we're all, as I mentioned, very familiar with the housing bubble collapse. But there were 4 specific ways that we can observe how that affected housing markets. So number one, we saw significant declines in total employment between 2007 and 2009. And of course, as we all know, if you don't have a job, you can't buy a house. So significant declines in employment have a direct causal factor on reductions in overall housing demand that we saw throughout the U.S. We also saw significant house price depreciation because of lower demand in specific markets across the country. But of course, this was broad-based, and we see, and I'll show you evidence of that in South Carolina as well. We saw a reduction in the number of household formations. That is just now beginning to pick up again in 2015. And then also lower household income, again, as a direct result of lower employment. Because, of course, if people don't have employment, they're going to see lower disposable income. So that's a natural consequence of point number one there. So just quickly going through some of these data, again, to reinforce these 4 points, we see this reduction in employment from a U.S. perspective. And you can see the dramatic drop-off in beginning in 2008, but especially in 2009 and 2010. We've seen recovery since then, but that decline, of course, led to reductions in overall housing demand. We see in South Carolina the reductions in house price appreciation. This looks at the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which is really the standard bearer for tracking house price appreciation in local markets. But we can see in South Carolina overall, the dramatic decline. Markets really bottomed out in South Carolina in 2011, 2012, depending on which market we're looking at. But you can see where we began to see appreciation again, for the most part in 2012. But again, these are ramifications of the Great Recession. U.S. household formation growth, as I said, in 2015, it's only just now begun to pick back up. But of course, people without employment, not able to form households, and we saw a significant decline relative to historical averages. And again, just trying to put this in perspective over the last decade or so. And you can see what the ramifications look like from the Great Recession, and also see how in 2015, that's begun to pick up again. And I'm going to come back to this point here shortly and talk about how housing markets in South Carolina have really seen an increase, or housing in general has seen an increase in demand over the last year. Which has been fueled in large part by the fact that we've seen more household formation locally in South Carolina. And then finally, we can also look at income. As I mentioned, household income down. This gives you a sense of what per capita personal income in South Carolina looks like. And this black bar here represents the historical average. So just in any given period, in any given year, we can compare what that looks like relative to its historical average. So as you can see in 2015, we're just getting back maybe to that historical average, but certainly over the last several years, personal income has been lower than its historical average, and certainly lower than where we would like to see it. So that gives us a sense of what housing markets look like in terms of their contribution to the overall national economy, when we try to put it in perspective for the U.S. economy. And now I want to turn and look a little bit more at what's happening in South Carolina. I want to set the stage for talking about what we've seen over the last 6 years, some of our economic trends, and how housing markets have responded to that, and how that fits into what the story of South Carolina has shown in terms of economic growth, again, since 2010, since the Great Recession ended. And the long and short of it is that this past year, 2015, has been by far the best year that South Carolina has seen since the end of the Great Recession. We're in our 6th year right now of recovery. And really, I think we need to begin to talk about it as an expansion, not a recovery, because by many metrics, we have recovered the jobs lost. We've recovered and gotten back to levels, regardless of which indicators we're looking at, we've gotten back to levels that we were at back in 2007 before the recession hit. So as we're expanding to new areas and new rates of growth, we can begin to think of it as a genuine economic expansion rather than merely an economic recovery. But regardless, this past year has been by far the best that South Carolina has seen. We're gaining momentum. And we are seeing it statewide. It's broad-based, meaning it's across multiple industries. And as I mentioned, it's strong. So let me give you some evidence for that and then show you how housing markets in particular and the construction industry fits into that picture. So first of all, one of our best ways of getting a sense of the overall health of a local economy is to really look at employment growth. That's really the single best indicator that we use if we have to pick one to get a sense of what the health of the local economy looks like. So you can see employment growth going back to 2002 in South Carolina. And I draw your attention to that 2.7%, which we saw in 2015. And that's the benchmark so kind of keep that number in your head as we go forward. I'm going to show you some other numbers, and that's the one you want to compare to, that 2.7%. So first of all, notice that it is higher than any other year that we've seen since 2010. And secondly, notice that it's also higher than any year and significantly higher than any year that we saw during the housing boom, during the previous expansion. So again, by this measure, which is really the standard measure, the single best measure that we can gauge for the health of a local economy, South Carolina is doing fairly well. We're gaining momentum, and it is definitely the best year that we've seen in this current expansion, as well as the previous expansion as well. So we're gaining on that momentum. Another way that we can see that is to look at the number of jobs per month that South Carolina has been adding. So we don't need to go through the individual numbers here, but the bottom line here is that if you look at these red bars, those represent the monthly average job gains for each year going back to 2010. And once again, the long and short of it here, without going into the specific numbers, is to look at that trend and notice that since 2011, we've seen a steady increase in terms of the number of jobs per month. So overall, South Carolina has been gaining momentum. And anytime you look at these numbers, I like to say the trend is your friend. So it's difficult to look at a single number and look at a snapshot and see what's going on. So it's helpful to look more at the long run to see what these trends look like. So once again, the idea here is that we're seeing employment growth improve, and we're seeing that we're gaining momentum in South Carolina by this particular measure. But it's not the only measure. Another way that we can see this is if we look at what are called leading economic indicators. And this represents leading economic indicators as defined by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And what they do is compile a number of different statistics into basically an index that provides perspective on what they expect for the next 6 months in every state, as well as the United States as a whole. So if you've got a leading index that says, well, if it's relatively high, we expect more growth, more economic activity over the next 6 months. And we can rank the states relative to each other, and that's what the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia does. And so here we're comparing specifically South Carolina, their index for South Carolina, to the U.S. overall. And as you can see, for the most part, South Carolina, going back to 2010, is fairly consistently ranked above the national average. And the reason I bring this up is because is to put into context what South Carolina's growth has looked like, our overall economic growth, relative to the national average. South Carolina, by a number of measures, has ranked closer to the top among most states and has been doing quite well overall. So it's not South Carolina is not growing necessarily in the same way that the U.S. is and all other states are. It's somewhat unique in terms of its high rate of growth and the fact that we're gaining momentum and that we're moving in a positive direction. The one exception to this, as you've probably already noticed, is the late part of 2015 where we saw a significant drop-off, and that's due to the October floods. And one of the measures that is used when coming up with this index is unemployment insurance claims. So typically that is a leading economic indicator that we look to get a sense of what's coming going forward. And when unemployment insurance claims go up, that's an indication that we're seeing more layoffs and that the economy may be slowing down. So that's why they use it in this particular index. But during the flood, as we all know, there was massive unemployment for a short period of time because of the disruptions. And so we saw a spike in unemployment insurance claims, and that explains why we see that major decline relative to the national average in terms of these leading indicators. So again, just trying to put this in perspective of what South Carolina is doing relative to other states and relative to the national average more generally. Now, briefly, let's talk about what's happening regionally. As I mentioned, that 2.7% employment growth is really the benchmark number to think about, certainly over the last year. So we can compare what different local regions look like relative to this statewide average. And in general, what we're finding is that the major metropolitan regions are beginning to converge around this state average. South Carolina has largely been a story of advanced manufacturing, automotive manufacturing in the upstate, aerospace manufacturing in Charleston, and tires. We're the number one tire exporter now here in South Carolina. So that's been driving much of our growth, certainly during the early part of this economic recovery. But in recent years, particularly in the last year, it has expanded to become more broad-based across more industries and across more regions. So as you can see here, most of the major metropolitan regions have done fairly well over the last year on the whole. And that leads us back to housing. So I've begun to paint a picture for what economic growth overall and what South Carolina has looked like over the last several years. But in 2015, this graph shows you a snapshot of what growth has looked like by industry super sectors. So if we take the various industries in South Carolina and kind of aggregate them up and create these categories, you can see what growth has looked like. And the first thing I draw your attention to is the fact that going back to that 2.7% number that I mentioned before is kind of our benchmark. Most of these, or many of these industries, are growing faster than that state average. That was not the case just 1 year ago. So broad-based growth across multiple industries is something that's relatively new. And you'll notice that the number one industry over the last year has actually been construction at 4.8%. So growing significantly faster than the state average of 2.7%. So why is that happening? Why is that happening in 2015? And why is that happening now, especially given that construction has been one of the lagging industries before 2015, with not nearly the rate of growth that we've seen here. Again, if I showed you this graph 1, 2, 3 years ago, construction would have been closer to the bottom, certainly not the number one industry. Well, what's happening is that in South Carolina, we've seen 4 things happen, particularly in 2015. Number one, we've seen more employment growth, as I've shown you, the highest rate of employment growth that we've seen in the last 6 years. And that has translated into additional wage growth, which I'm going to talk more about here in just a moment. So we've had employment growth, which has led to more wage growth across multiple industries. And the reason is that just as we can talk about any market in terms of supply and demand, when the demand for labor rises, which it has as employment growth has increased, that's put upward pressure on wages. So we've seen wage growth across multiple industries in South Carolina for the first time in 2015. That has then led to more consumer spending and more disposable income for households. That's also one of the reasons why we've seen household formation go up for the first time in 2015, going back to that graph I showed you before. And then part of consumer spending, of course, is housing. So as people have had more disposable income, they're making the decision now to buy when before they may not have been able to. They now have jobs. And so we're seeing housing is seeing the result of this more broad-based growth and is benefiting from that. And so the demand for housing is rising as we're seeing employment growth and all of the consequences for that. So it's a very logical process going from employment growth to wage growth to increases in disposable income. And part of that leads to more consumer spending, which includes housing markets in particular. Now, we can talk about wage growth. That's not something I've spent a lot of time on, so I just want to briefly address where we're seeing that in particular. So two industries I want to spend a little more time talking about. Number one is manufacturing. Now, as I mentioned before, manufacturing has really been a driving force behind our overall economic growth at the state level over the last several years. And I want to just focus on the fact that where the growth is coming from in manufacturing. Notice what the average wage looks like among these jobs that are being created, about $66,000 a year. Now, how does that compare to the average job in South Carolina? Well, it's significantly higher. The average wage in South Carolina is about $39,000 a year. So manufacturing, especially the areas that are seeing high rates of growth, of course, textiles being the major exception there, but if we look at durable goods manufacturing, which is where we see aerospace and automotive housed and tires housed as well, we see we see jobs being created that are paying wages significantly above the state average. So that's where part of the increased income is coming from. The second place is if we look at professional and business services. Now, again, I don't want to spend too much time going through the nuances of these definitions, but the bottom line is that professional and business services is this large category that we throw a lot of different industries into, so it doesn't mean a whole lot. But one of the subcategories within professional and business services is this sector called professional, scientific, and technical services. And that is really the heart and soul of high-wage jobs in South Carolina or in any region. So professional and scientific and technical services encompasses things like accountants, things like engineers, architects, computer design, computer programming, managers, all of the positions, all these professional services that we typically associate with high-wage positions. Most of them, or at least a large percentage of them, are concentrated within this subsector, this professional, scientific, and technical services subsector. And so the bottom line here is that if we look at professional and business services, it's generating a number of new jobs, and the jobs that are coming from this subsector that is concentrated and houses these high-wage jobs is going up. Does that make sense? So we see this growth coming from professional and business services, but in the last year, we've seen more of those come from this professional, scientific, and technical services subsector, which is the heart of a lot of these high-wage jobs in South Carolina. So because of that, and because of the new high-wage jobs creating in manufacturing, that together is what's creating a lot of this increased disposable income, which is leading to the additional consumer spending that we're seeing. And as I mentioned, we see this leading to upward pressure on wages overall, and to a large extent, 2015 has really been the tipping point. So we've seen employment growth, of course, increasing for several years now. This is not the first year in 2015, but it is really the tipping point because the labor market is getting tight enough to where we're actually seeing upward pressure put on wages. And this is a national perspective. Shows us the national job openings rate, and you can see that it's at the highest rate at any point going back to 2001. So this really tells us that if we look at the labor market, if we look at the demand side, the labor market is pretty healthy. And again, that's reflected in the fact that we're seeing wage growth across more industries in South Carolina. One other thing that I want to mention on South Carolina's economy that goes right to the bottom line here in talking about what's been happening over the last 6 years is that now that we've reached that tipping point and we've seen more employment growth, we're seeing wage growth, that's also turning the tables on the labor force, meaning that in South Carolina, more people are coming back into the labor force. They're seeing opportunities, whereas before they hadn't. Many people had given up and dropped out, and we're seeing that trend begin to reverse. So if we look at South Carolina's labor force growth, as you can see here, going back to 2007, in the last 2 years, we've seen really a reversal in the trend of it being relatively stagnant. Not a whole lot of change there, but that is beginning to reverse again because we're seeing more employment growth and people see this. They recognize that there are more opportunities, so they're coming back into the market. And again, that's leading to more demand for housing on the whole. So how do we observe this specifically? What are some other ways we can see housing markets in high demand? Where's the evidence for that aside from just looking at employment growth? Well, one area that we can look at it is by breaking down the construction industry, which is what I showed you before, into looking at the difference between new construction activity and also between remodeling. And I draw your attention here to look at construction of buildings. So these are the three subcategories that we can divide construction into. And I want to draw your attention to the construction of buildings there, which represents new construction, and then specialty trade contractors, which is in green, and that represents essentially the remodelers. Those are the two large sectors within these big three. And notice what's been happening with new construction. If we look at year-over-year changes in terms of growth, going back to 2014. Well, we've had an increase between 2014 and 2015, but a very sizable increase between 2015 and 2016. So what is this telling us? Especially when we compare that to these green bars, to the remodelers, that's been relatively stagnant or slightly declining between 2014 and 2016. It tells us that as people are becoming employed, as they have more disposable income, have more household net wealth, that they are changing their preferences. And we see more people that have been on the fence before, thinking about whether to buy, whether to remodel. They're making that decision to purchase a home or to move. And again, that's facilitating increased demand for housing in South Carolina. So in lieu of remodeling, more people are choosing to purchase, and this makes sense, right? Because if we're in a tighter market where people are not looking to spend money that they don't have or any more than they have to, if they're going to make a purchase decision regarding their home, they're more likely to remodel or make changes to their existing house rather than to necessarily purchase another residence. We see this in housing appreciation in terms of the FHFA. We talked about this before, but here I just want to focus on markets within South Carolina, looking at Charleston, Columbia, Greenville, and then especially Hilton Head. And the reason I focus on Hilton Head is because it has the largest percentage of second home markets in South Carolina. If we look at the major markets, particularly along the coastal region of the state. And so it's typically the last one to come back in terms of positive house price appreciation following a recession. And it has turned positive as well. So again, just to provide some specifics in terms of additional evidence where we're seeing housing markets come back, more demand, and that's manifesting itself in terms of overall house price appreciation in markets in South Carolina. So that gives us a sense of what's been happening in terms of economic growth in the state, in South Carolina, how that translates to increased demand for housing markets across the state. So we've talked about South Carolina. We've talked about more general trends in terms of housing's contribution to the U.S. economy. And now I want to turn the tables a little bit and talk more about local trends and local indicators and put in perspective the different metrics that we look at and how they interact with one another. So as we move ahead and you're considering different policies, what are the indicators that you need to be looking at when you're considering the ramifications on different housing markets? How can we begin to highlight that and put that into perspective? So we can start off by talking about the pillars of growth. Anytime we're talking about a local region and we want to assess the health of a local region and determine how best to facilitate that, there are four major pillars of growth that lead to a prospering local economy. And they are geography, industry, workforce, and housing. So housing is most definitely one of the big four there. But we can go through each one in turn. So geography, number one, if we look at natural resources and the location, of course, every local area has some natural amenities, natural benefits, and of course, some areas are more desirable than others. And that's just part of any local environment. So that's going to provide advantages and disadvantages, and it's going to play a major role in the simple desirability of an area, both from the perspective of people wanting to live there and industries wanting to locate there as well. So that's a big factor. Of course, industry is a big factor as well. That produces employment. So which type of industries are going to be locating in a particular region? Industry growth and how that's comprised makes a huge difference in the health of a local economy, whether it thrives or not. Of course, workforce is critically important as well. It fills the industry demand for labor, and then housing provides we have to house a local workforce as well. So all of these go together, and when you have the right combination of these four, that's how you really get to a thriving economy. And I think it's very this quote here is very very meaningful in this sense. If we talk about people attracting business and housing attracting people, so once again, all of these go together. It's not one or the other. All of these have to work together in order to create a thriving local region, whichever region that we happen to be talking about. So if we look at Tega Cay and Fort Mill, one of the indicators that we can start with, one of the most basic indicators to look at over time, is population growth, to give us a sense of what demand is looking like for both for housing and for markets in general. And we can see, as you all know, Tega Cay and Fort Mill have seen dramatic population increases, certainly over the last 25 years or so. And you see here the rate of growth has been significantly high relative to the state average, which has been just under 2%. To put this in perspective, so the state average population growth just under 2% annually, and you can see in both cases, whether we're looking at Tega Cay or Fort Mill, the average population growth has been significantly higher. For Tega Cay in particular, increasing from about 3,000 to about 9,000 between 1990 and 2015. So what does this tell us? What are the consequences of significant population growth? Well, there are several, but one that we can really hone in on in terms of just looking at a cause and effect relationship here, population growth combined with a relatively fixed town size is going to have a consequence of significant house price appreciation. And again, this just goes back to the simple law of supply and demand. When we have relatively low supply, that's going to bid up the prices for housing, and so we're going to see relatively high house price appreciation. And so the question is, what does that look like when we try and get a sense of that in these two local areas, both if we're looking at Tega Cay or Fort Mill, and how does that compare to other markets in South Carolina? Well, we can get a sense by looking at the median home price and comparing that across regions in South Carolina. So for example, if we look at Tega Cay there relative to other regions of the state, Tega Cay has one of the highest median home prices in the state, and Fort Mill is also substantially above the state average. You can see for South Carolina it's about $137,000 compared to about $290,000 in Tega Cay, $190,000 in Fort Mill. And we can also compare that to what's happening in York County as a whole. And the other area I wanted to compare this to put this in perspective is looking at Mount Pleasant relative to Charleston County. So when you see here 83% higher, what that means is that Tega Cay, the median home price is about 83% higher than York County as a whole, which is actually significantly higher than when we do that same comparison for Mount Pleasant compared to Charleston County. And Mount Pleasant has essentially the high, depending on when we look, but essentially the highest median home price in South Carolina, right around $351,000. So we can see house price appreciation to a large extent resulting from population growth, and that's both normal. That's a normal consequence there, and we can quantify what that actually looks like. And so that leads us to talking about purchasing power and how we begin to evaluate different markets in terms of affordability. And one way that we look at this when we're comparing different markets and we're trying to get a sense of what affordability looks like is using this rule of thumb, which I call ability to purchase, but you can call it, in any number of different things. And the rule of thumb, which comes essentially from looking at, this is a rule of thumb from the literature that comes from looking at financial markets and looking at what financial institutions are willing to lend to buyers, and that is that households generally can obtain a mortgage and purchase a home that's approximately 2.5 to 3 times their annual income. So again, just a rule of thumb that we typically see because of what financial institutions are doing, and the reason for that is at that level it's typically financeable, meaning that they're actually able to get the loan, and it's sustainable, meaning that in this case, as judged by financial institutions, mortgage payments are typically low enough as a percentage of household income that they can weather some uncertainty. So for example, if there's a layoff in the household or some unemployment, or they have some type of transition period where their income changes, they're less likely to have to go into foreclosure or have problems paying their mortgage. So once again, this is just a rule of thumb from the financial sector that we can use as a proxy for beginning to think about affordability. And so as we do that, one of the things then that we can look at when we're comparing markets across markets is we can go in and say, all right, well, let's look at in different markets, let's look at what the median home price is, and then let's compare that to what the average or the median income looks like in these different markets. And how does this ability to purchase or this ratio, how does it differ across markets? What does it look like? And that can give some insight into as we begin thinking about this affordability phenomenon and how it changes over time. So here we've just compared this purchasing ratio, done some cross-market comparisons. You can see going, these are all counties now, going down from Charleston all the way down to Lexington. So all of these are South Carolina counties with the exception of Mecklenburg up in Charlotte. And you can see Charleston in particular kind of sticks out like a sore thumb there at 4.5, so well above sort of the sweet spot, again, if we consider the sweet spot between 2.5 and 3. And again, there's some wiggle room there, but my goal here is to give you some guidelines on measuring these different data points. But 4.5 definitely sticks out like I said, like a sore thumb there. But we can look at the different markets throughout South Carolina and neighboring Charlotte. So Mecklenburg right around 3.2. If we look at York County where we are, about 3.0. And if we look at Tega Cay and Fort Mill, they're both right around 2.5. So on I don't have those listed here, but those are on the lower side. And in the case of Tega Cay, that's primarily because of the higher median income in Tega Cay, which is about $120,000. So what we're seeing in Tega Cay, as you all know, is that many people are commuting to Charlotte, and so Tega Cay is largely reliant on the Charlotte market and particularly the finance industry there, which pays very well, and we see that manifested in terms of median incomes being relatively high in the local area, and that's why that market or that purchasing ratio tends to be relatively low despite the high pricing, high relative price there. So if we look at the characteristics here of Tega Cay, again, a little more closely, and Fort Mill, so all these numbers here, the ones in parentheses refer to Fort Mill, the ones that are not refer to Tega Cay. So more income in general, more expensive homes, and if we look at the percentage of the population, we can look at differences there as well. And again, we only put that in there just to showcase where a lot of this employment is coming from, and the fact that in both markets we see Charlotte driving much of what's happening, and is the source for a lot of the employment in the local area. So what are the upside potentials and downside risks when we begin to think about policy decisions going forward and how to evaluate them? Well, there are a number of ways to think about this. I think if we look at the upside potential, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that when we look at local markets, when they are strongly dependent on a single geographic region or a single industry, that introduces risk. And so when we have a market or a local area that is largely dependent, in this case, on the Charlotte market or in the finance industry, then that makes that introduces more risk than having a more diversified economy. And when we think about construction, and when we think about industry, and we think about growth, all of these things have to go together. So it's really, in some sense, a trade-off between being more reliant on Charlotte's market or an external market versus which makes these local markets more vulnerable to a recession, or more vulnerable to being seeing reductions in economic activity during a recession, as compared to being more diverse with more local industry, and which in part, of course, would be housing, but it's a combination of these factors. So when you develop local industry, you're less reliant, again, on an external market. And when you have more diverse markets in the local area, then you tend to see more stable environments and more stable economies in the long run. So by attracting local industry, you build a more diverse, economically stable economy, tends to keep housing affordable, and the ability also for residents to live where they work. So one of the other questions then becomes, if we look at the downside risks, is it sustainable if the need is to import workers for local services? So one of the things to be considered is that when basically employment is largely driven by the Charlotte market, which again is producing relatively high median incomes. And the question becomes, if that is continued going forward, and we see this house prices continue to appreciate, the local service industry then has to commute in. And the question becomes, is that sustainable? Once again, that's just another ramification going forward, and another trade-off that has to be considered. So there are a number of upside potentials and downside risks. And again, all of these indicators work together as we look ahead to help make these decisions and to help think through this. All right, so that looks at some of the local indicators, and I want to conclude by talking about some future sources of growth. So how do we begin to evaluate local policy decisions going forward, and looking at what the impact of a particular construction project or development project would look like? How will we begin to assess that? And as I mentioned, this is not I'm not providing a policy recommendation tonight, but I am trying to provide tools that you can use to help make these decisions. And one way is to look at an economic impact analysis. Now, some of you may be familiar with this, some of you not, so I want to talk about, in general, what economic impact analysis looks like and how that relates to the housing industry in particular. So when we look at the impact of a particular business or a particular development project or any type of new economic activity in a local region, we can analyze that by looking at not only the direct spending activity that occurs within a local region coming from that new development or that new business, so new dollars being injected into the local economy, but how does that then ripple through the economy through additional rounds of spending? So if an organization comes into the local region, they're going to purchase inputs and supplies for their business. Or the development will. They're going to hire workers, and in both cases, these workers are going to go out and spend money, and the companies that are hired to serve as suppliers for, again, the business or the development, they're going to see an increase in demand and going to have to go out and purchase and hire as well. So we see these initial dollars get spent over and over again, and so that is something that we can actually quantify in a local market and determine what the actual impact is going to be. And then some cost-benefit questions can be answered as we look at what those economic benefits are as a whole. So an initial change in economic activity, as I show here, leads to spending activity, multiple rounds, and then we can quantify what that aggregate impact on economic activity is, gross state product, job creation, and income creation as well. And as I mentioned, there are three ways that we see this. We have what's known as the direct effects, where we see the economic impact that arises from the actual new spending activity, from the new development or the new business. And then that leads to two sets of multiplier effects. One, what we call the indirect effects, or the supply chain multiplier effect. And that's when a business comes in, it purchases inputs and supplies. Those suppliers then see obviously an increase in demand. They go out and purchase from their suppliers, hire additional workers because they're seeing that increase in demand. And then those suppliers see increases in demand, and those suppliers, and so on and so forth. So that initial round of spending on behalf of the new business sees multiple additional rounds of spending within the local economy through that supply chain. Secondly, we see the same effect with what we call the induced effect, or the household spending multiplier. And in that case, the same effect occurs, but this time it's through household purchases. So when people are hired, they spend part of their money in the local economy on the same things that you and I would. They go out and they go out to eat. They may buy a house. They may purchase any number of different goods and services. And so all of those industries see an increase in demand as well. So if we aggregate this up, we talk about the supply chain multiplier, we talk about the household spending multiplier, and add those to the direct effects, then you get this aggregate impact, this total economic impact from a specific initial set of business activities. And so that's what we can quantify here. So in this case, just a quick example, if we see a new community development, the direct effect is the increase in overall construction activity, again, that we see from the development itself. That leads to indirect effects through construction-related suppliers, and then also to an indirect effect, which is increased business demand through a variety of industries because of additional wages which are then being spent within the local economy. And so these direct effects lead to both the supply chain multiplier and the household spending multiplier. And then we also see effects going from the supply chain multiplier straight to additional household spending. So for example, when a supplier sees an increase in demand, part of how they respond to that is to hire additional workers. And then those workers go out and purchase additional items in the local economy as well. So again, it creates a loop here so that we see these additional ripple effects throughout the local economy. And again, the bottom line is that we can quantify this and actually measure what it looks like. And in terms of a housing industry multiplier, typically in South Carolina, what we see is that the employment multiplier associated with the construction industry is roughly 1.8. Now, this is a fairly conservative estimate because this doesn't take into account all the housing-related services. So going back to what I talked about earlier, if we look at what the impact of housing is on the economy, you've got the construction, the bricks and sticks, as well as the housing-related services. This just looks at construction, and the multiplier is 1.8, which essentially means that for every 10 jobs that are created in the construction industry, on average, we see another 8 jobs created elsewhere in the economy. So what does this tell us? This is a simple way to quantify what the aggregate economic impact is from the perspective of employment. And again, this is an industry average, and we can always say that your mileage may vary. So this doesn't apply to every specific project, which is why we have to look at individual projects and do this analysis on a specific basis. But again, I'm trying to give you some general perspective on typically what we see for the industry as a whole. So I will stop there and quickly summarize. So we've looked at overall what the impact of construction and how the housing industry is at a macro level. We've talked about how in South Carolina the growth that we've seen over the last 6 years has really given rise to increases in housing demand, particularly in 2015, and how that's building momentum. So we expect to see that continue in 2016. We've looked at local markets, Tega Cay and Fort Mill, and looked at some of the indicators that we can get a sense of in terms of what different effects of different variables will have in terms of how they interact with one another and how that affects affordability going forward. And then we've talked about future ways that we can think about contributions to growth and how we can begin to measure that and assess that specifically. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention, and I guess I'll turn it back over to you all for questions.
Wow, thank you. Before we go down with the questions, I'll let council continue to write down their questions. Just want to make a couple comments. This will be on the city's website tomorrow afternoon. For those of you who were not able to see this or would like to share it with your friends, it will be on the city's website tomorrow afternoon. And Charlie, is it possible for us to take this presentation and put it on the website so that people can see that and follow it through like we were able to do on council?
Yes, sir. It's actually on the website now on our agendas minutes page.
Perfect.
It's posted there now.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm open for suggestions on how we want to do this. I'm sure everybody's chomping at the bit to ask questions. Do we just start on one end and go to the other? Does that work, or does everybody just want to raise their hand and dive in with a question? All right. You just got pointed to. You're starting.
Ronnie, you got a question?
You good? Okay. Dottie?
I don't think I have a question. I mean, I guess the comment is, and it isn't shocking, right? If the economy is good, then the trickle-down effects associated with the positive economy are growth and spending and so forth and so on, right? So, I mean, that's a big part of what your discussion was about, right? If employment is up, if wages are up and employment is up, then necessarily construction is probably also increasing.
Yes, and,
Right.
and we're seeing that, again, I think very clearly across markets in South Carolina. Tega Cay and Fort Mill are part of that, but it's certainly not isolated here. Housing markets in general have seen a dramatic turnaround in 2015 in South Carolina.
And so this is the boom, or another boom, and hopefully this will go on forever and ever and ever. But we may face, again, another bust at some point, just because the economy does that to us every once in a while. And so the negative sides, I suppose, of all of this growth and the positive in the construction is that at some point you may have empty homes or overpriced homes or that sort of thing. I mean, just the normal market trend, right?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes, we are going to go into another recession at some point. You know, in terms of looking out where that is, I think right now for 2016, there are real no indications that that's going to happen this year. But yes, of course, we're going to go through business cycles. We will see a decline in housing markets. I think one thing that we can say this time, and I didn't include tonight, but in terms of looking and comparing the previous expansion to this one and sort of the housing bubble that we saw before, for housing markets in general, they are looking much healthier this time around. And the way we see that is that house price appreciation, we have to compare house price appreciation to employment growth. And what we saw in the previous expansion during the housing bubble was we saw these huge increases in house price appreciation relative to employment growth, which implied that this house price appreciation wasn't being sustained by, the demand wasn't real, for lack of a better term,
Right.
because it wasn't sustained by employment growth. This time around, in an aggregate perspective, when we look at South Carolina and in many U.S. markets, though not all, that is not happening this time around. So the appreciation that we're seeing, first of all, it's not as dramatic as it was in the previous bubble, at least not yet. But more importantly, it's being supported by actual employment growth,
Right.
Which means that even when we do go into a recession, which of course we eventually will, we're not looking at the major crash that we were last time. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is that when we look at the more you see house price appreciation and this affordability issue come up in different local markets, that does make a local area more vulnerable than the larger region, simply because of that restriction in supply. As you see these house prices sort of artificially
Inflated.
propped up.
Yeah, I mean, in the boom, the Great Recession, as you've been referring to it, you know, South Carolina really wasn't, quote, hit quite as hard, so to speak,
Right.
perhaps as other regions were. But I guess a possibility based on this economic growth, the indicators that we see now for South Carolina is sort of the higher we go, the harder we might fall in another time when there is another recession or what have you, which
think-
is. Which doesn't say that's not a reason to not grow, not build, not do any of those things. It's just, I guess, reflecting the reality that the next time around, South Carolina, not just Fort Mill and Tega Cay, could feel effects of a downturn more so than maybe we felt the first time around or the last time around.
Right. If the prices are artificially inflated, I think that's true. But the degree to which there's industry development, to which there's construction activity that mitigates that, that lessens that overall effect.
And based on the work that you've done and what you've reported to us, I mean, can you say at this point that there does not appear to be currently this artificial inflation, that the level of growth that we see, the level of prices that are going higher in the housing industry and so forth are generally in line with the job growth and so forth in the area, as opposed to some artificial number that, again, makes it harder when we fall?
I would say at the state level that is true. I'd say if we look at the local markets, if we look at Tega Cay and Fort Mill, I think there is that has to be an important consideration moving ahead when deciding how to proceed with different growth policies, because Tega Cay and Fort Mill have especially high median prices now. The question is, if those continue to appreciate significantly, what is going to be the long run implication of that? Because when we look at, again, comparing wage growth to house price appreciation, typically wage growth lags behind or does not keep up with house price appreciation. So over time, even though, for example, we see much of the employment coming out of Charlotte, Charlotte wage growth is going to be much slower. Wage growth in general is going to be slower than the house price appreciation that we've seen. And so the question is, what's going to happen, and to what degree do we see house prices appreciate over the next several years, or in the short run and in the long run, based on how construction markets evolve here, based on different policies. So I think that's a concern to look at.
And it might be positive, actually, that cities like Tega Cay and towns like Fort Mill rely to some degree, and I think more heavily than not right now, on, say, the Charlotte economy and the Charlotte jobs. Because if all of the industry and the jobs were here in our own city and town, and something happened and we were laying off hundreds, thousands of people, whatever it happens to be, then you have both the industrial, the business negative impact and the housing negative impact all at the same time in one concentrated area.
Yeah, I think you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. So yes, Charlotte is a critical component of growth here and in York County in general, absolutely. But I think again, it's a diverse strategy, and South Carolina has come under the same discussions as well, because we've heard advanced manufacturing. It's all about the Boeings and the BMWs and just manufacturing. Well, that's great, and we need that to be part of our expansion. But there's a concern once again, that same phenomenon, putting all our eggs in one basket.
Yep.
So you don't want to be reliant solely on Charlotte's economy, just as we don't want to be solely reliant on that one industry.
Thank you.
Lisa?
A statement as much as a statement and question. When we're talking about here, Fort Mill and Tega Cay, it can be assumed that this is the York County Township, Fort Mill Township. So there's a lot, we technically have 3 entities that incorporate these numbers. So it can be assumed that the entire township would be at these level of numbers, correct? That
Yeah.
it's not just within the town limits.
Yes, in general, the trends that I talked about would be fair to generalize to the full region.
And do you see, for us, we call it north of the river, there's a big difference, it seems, in all of these factors that you talked about when you look at north of the river versus south of the river. I think, my opinion, and I'd love your input on it, is the north of the river is that bedroom community of Charlotte where people are going to Charlotte for jobs, where it feels like south of the river, the Rock Hill, Chester area, ends up being more of that manufacturing, more of a different breed of economics coming in for the employment there.
I think that's generally true. There's some mix and match there,
Right.
but I don't think that's an unfair statement. But it's hard for me to speculate on
Right.
that without looking at it. But I don't think what you're saying is unfair, an unfair characterization, generally speaking.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
David?
Thank you. Well, that was a very interesting brief. There's no doubt about it. On the macro level, housing is very important to our economy. I'm kind of concerned with the municipal level, I guess I should say. And I've been carrying some things around in my notebook for a couple of weeks, and it just so happens you're here to talk to us. So it's great that you're appearing at this time. I was just wondering your thoughts on when we have so many houses being built, there becomes a new need for services. The roads, the schools, police, fire. And I was just wondering if you had a general opinion. This might not be a fair question. You're more of a macro type, it sounds like. But does growth ever pay for itself, or does, you know what I'm trying to get at?
Yes. So that's an excellent question. And the short answer is it depends, and I can't answer that with certainty. There is, I would say, general consensus in the literature, in the economics literature, that oftentimes that answer is yes. But without looking at the specifics of a local region, I can't really speculate in this case to say yes or no.
I thought that's what you're going to say. We
Sounds like a politician, doesn't it?
right.
Yeah.
Well, that's I think the other question to that point is it's not an unanswerable question.
Right.
So that's something that we can look at, and that economists can look at in a particular region. There's a methodology for doing that and doing a cost-benefit analysis. But I haven't looked at those data here locally, so I can't answer that question.
Well, in the last couple of weeks, we've been throwing around what we call the Clemson study. And the Clemson study, I don't know if that's what it's called, but I don't have it with me for one reason, where a professor at Clemson looked at York. I don't believe it was county. I think it was York City.
City of York, correct.
The city of York, or
Yes, City of York.
built 285 or so houses, and it tried to find what the cost was after 5 years, and it found out that the city, I think they lost money. That growth didn't pay for itself in that instance. And I was wondering if you had, I was looking at your pillars of growth here, and that's what kind of brought it up. That you've got some things we really can't affect, geography, but industry and housing. We used to say here, for every dollar that we take in taxes, it costs, we have to spend $1.60 or 70 in services for a resident, but every dollar we bring in from a business only needs 30 cents. Have you heard anything like that before? Is that just something we say up here in York County or in Tega Cay?
That's not really a.
It's not a quantifiable, probably.
Well, all the questions you're asking, for the most part, are quantifiable, but it's, once again, because it varies so much at the local level.
Yeah.
We've really got to look at this particular market in order to answer that with any authority.
Well, how about the mix of commercial versus residential? Maybe you know more about that. It said that the national average, the mix that ensures that there is a broad tax base to pay for services, calls for 44% residential tax base and a 56% commercial tax base. And it seems like our area is just the opposite. Do you have any comment about that?
Just in terms of, read those numbers again?
This is from our county newsletter. The national average, let's see, and the mix that ensures there is a broad tax base to pay for services calls for a 44% residential tax base and a 56% commercial tax base. And it says this area is just the opposite. So it's about a 60-40 mix of commercial versus residential is optimal, I guess, to keep from paying more taxes for more services. I know
it's just not really a specific area. I can't address those specific numbers.
I knew when I was hearing your briefing, because you were more in the macro, that I knew that our municipal level questions. But let me just give you one final thing, an alternative view, because I've been carrying around with me. It kind of goes with the Clemson study. This is from Association Today, an article review of the population growth, density, and the cost of providing public services from George Conklin, North Carolina Central, Richard Dixon, UNC Wilmington, Chen Yu Hang, University of North Carolina. But just a short, brief synopsis. It says, the residential patterns typically appearing as one of the effects of urban growth increase the demand for road building, the need for spending money on new schools, public services, utilities, waste disposal, and water and sewer infrastructure follow. Police, fire, and emergency medical service must be provided immediately, but demand for recreational programs and centers won't be far behind. Even if developers are billed for the obvious additions to the roads and storm sewers, the effects of urban growth on public services are significant. Remember that even if a developer pays for the streets in the new development, those new residents must drive to work, shop, recreate, a serious rebuild sooner than had the growth not occurred. Transportation effects are felt in personal budgets as well. Households moving to the edge of the city will notice that their automobile-related expenses rise as they travel more miles. Many people suppose that the property taxes generated by the new development offset these costs, but only rarely does the residential development contribute as much as to the municipal coffers as it removes. Certainly in the case of new capital expenditures and public services, the public sector funding will not keep up. Many economists, in fact, assign a negative value to the impact of new residents on the public services. A new customer simply lightens the load for others. So many visitors to the site, now that's just other stuff. But the point is, I guess that growth doesn't always pay for itself, and that's the part of the economics that we have to kind of deal with at the municipal level. I was kind of hoping that we'd hear more about that, but I understand you're more of a macro in the big state. I'm glad that the state of South Carolina is doing so well, though.
Well, I just to follow up on that paragraph that you read there, I think that it's certainly descriptively that's certainly true that you have these additional infrastructure needs. I don't think there's any question there, but it does get back to that question of does housing pay for itself, and As I mentioned before, the answer is can
dependent.
be yes or no, and it depends.
Well, that's the struggle I guess we're having here is when we have all these new developments, we're having however many houses come in. Does it pay for itself, or do the people who aren't moving to the area that are already here and established, or they have an initial tax burden that's going to be on themselves?
Right.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you.
First, I want to thank you for the information that you did provide. And it is for a person that's a third-generation native here, having seen the textile industry provide everything for us, our eggs in one basket, and then disappear before our eyes. Essentially, we've seen the ebb and flow that's pretty extreme. I think it's important to note, what I derived from your presentation is that perhaps instead of the economic side of things, we really need to look at the psychological side of things. It truly boils down to what is perceived as healthy, as a healthy economy, as a healthy community, as, each one of us views that very differently. So I look at the numbers that you provided for the areas around Charleston, the areas around Greenville, Spartanburg, which used to have the higher industrial rates, and I think about how do you perceive those areas as healthy. And in most cases, and even in your documentation, it appears that having jobs and having income from those jobs are a very, one of your terms, a pillar of what health looks like. Would you agree with that?
Yes, in general, most economists, when they do forecasts and try to get the sense and compare regions, you're right. It comes down to quality and quantity. So the number of jobs matters, and the quality of jobs, which we measure by wages and by wage growth. So employment growth and wage growth is really the indicators that we typically look at, because ultimately local economic growth, or any economic growth, is about benefiting the citizens of the area. And that comes down to wages and employment growth largely from the perspective from economic growth of what we can measure very easily.
One of the questions I have is demographically, do we differ substantially from some of those other areas? Because when I am looking at my age and having children that are hopefully going to be employed long-term and live and spend in this area and pay taxes, I also have a mother that's 80 years old, and she's having to bear the burden continuously of taxes to pay for infrastructure and needs that she's already paid for hers. So I'm pretty sure we're not unique. I'm pretty certain that every other community has similar balances that they must strike. Is that true?
It is, and if we look at South Carolina in general, and I think this region of the state is no different. When you look at population growth in general, there two ways to get there. One, you have a net births over deaths, and one, you have net in-migration over out-migration. And most states have roughly a 60-40 split in terms of where their net population growth is coming from, and that 60% is coming from births over deaths. South Carolina is different. So most of ours come from in-migration for a number of reasons. As you know, we have we have a low cost of living. We have a nice climate. There are a number of positive reasons people come here. We have a large number of military retirees coming to South Carolina. So we are disproportionately affected by an aging population, or the graying of the population, and that matters. So when we look at this. When we look at these demographic changes, South Carolina certainly is going to see that certainly as much as any other part of the country, and in many respects more so.
And I think from your ability to look across data, I think having lived in South Carolina all my life, we have not typically been at the top in a portfolio of businesses or in higher education, or we have not really landed many accolades until more recently. Our state was probably in the bottom third of the country for much of what you've discussed. So when we see the growth in those areas that you're talking about exponentially with the percentages that you presented, then are we to ascertain that we are becoming more healthy? Is the growth contributing to a greater sense of health within the state?
I think the short answer to that is I would say yes, because the industries that are driving our growth are if we look out ahead, they are, well, a couple of comments, so let me back up. Number one, if we look at manufacturing trends in general, not just in South Carolina, but more broadly, manufacturing is moving south from a national perspective. And so South Carolina is taking advantage of some of these national trends that we don't really have any control over. And that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. So that's positive because we are building an anchor around industries that are going to that are going to be in higher demand over the next 10 to 20 years, and we're seeing that. And so South Carolina is largely competing against Alabama and Texas and
And North Carolina.
And North Carolina, yes. So that's a positive. The other thing that that's important as we move forward is to consider what we call industry cluster development. So an industry cluster is simply groups of firms that are related to one another, not necessarily in the identical industries, but that have enough overlap in terms of either workforce development or a labor pool or a number of other things. And clusters don't typically pick up and leave a local area the way individual firms do for any number of reasons. And so we have established very strong clusters in South Carolina, and that means that we're going to see higher rates of growth in the long run and more sustainable rates. So we're not going to get a lot of this variation, and that's why I stress diversity in cluster development, because if we do that, then that also makes us more resistant to recessions. Of course, we're never going to be fully resistant by any means, but it lowers the variation in growth over time, and that creates healthier growth and a healthier economy in the long run. So I think for all of these reasons that we are, South Carolina is getting healthier and becoming more prosperous. There are exceptions, of course, but in general, I think that's the direction that we're headed.
I don't want to dominate, so I'll be passing it along, but I do have a question. Since I have been on city council for 9 years and now as mayor, I've not once heard anybody to be able to justify the term, you have to have houses to get commercial growth. You cannot get commercial growth without the houses. Is that correct?
Can you get commercial growth? So can you get industry growth without having housing? I think when you're trying to attract industries, you have to provide incentives for them to be in a local area, and that comes across in a number of different ways. And workforce is very important. You've got to have qualified workers. You've got to have educated workers that fit the profile, and you have to be able to house them. You have to make it attractive for a workforce to be in a local area in order to have industry come here and hire them. So I think the two go together. I don't think there's any question about that. It all works together. It's not an either or. So I think that's fair.
It's very difficult to sit in our chairs because, to determine what's sustainable growth.
Sure.
To determine how do we manage the comfort level of healthy and what is perceived as healthy. We're a pass-through in many cases for people getting to work in Charlotte that don't live in Tega Cay or Fort Mill. But yet, our arteries and our roadways are clogged. So I think it's a very difficult role that we have. The information that you've provided has given me a little bit of hope that the state is improving and that we're not alone. So if anything, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of questions and comments. One, David, the study that you talked about, where you talked about how much it costs to provide a service to a residential home as opposed to a commercial home, was a study that was done in 2004 by the county manager, Al Green. And he said that for every dollar of service you collect, it costs you $1.45 to provide that service for that house. The question I have is, the value of that service hasn't changed. It still costs it still roughly costs the same. But if you're looking at the housing numbers that you mentioned here, in 2004, the price of a house in York County was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000, roughly. You're now telling me that in Tega Cay, value of a house is $290,000. So if you use those same numbers, that means that growth would pay for itself. Is that correct? If you're using, Correct. If you're using the same numbers that the county provided in 2004, that would mean that the growth is paying for itself, would it not?
Well, I think you're correct in that you do have to look at the marginal construction. So you would use the current numbers. So if what any new development looks like, what are we seeing in terms of pricing there, which is going to be more closer to the numbers that I presented. So those are the ones that you have to compare against. So again, without knowing that study, I'm hesitant to endorse that statement, but I think the logic there makes sense because you want to compare your cost to your current housing values and as you're seeing them today, not based on housing values 10 years old, because obviously they've changed dramatically.
Okay. And then I guess to piggyback on something that Dottie said, the state of South Carolina was declared one of the hardest hit areas during the Great Recession. Is that true?
No, I didn't mean to say that.
No, I'm stating that. I'm asking that question. Were we considered one of the hardest state areas in the state?
South Carolina in general, no, was not.
Was not.
Was not. And housing markets were not in general. But the major exception to that is the coastal markets of the state. So Hilton Head and Charleston were hit very, very hard. The rest of the state generally was not.
Okay.
Again, relative to I don't want to say we weren't hit hard, but relative to the national average, it was the coastal areas that were hit hard.
Going through your presentation, I'm sure you looked at the Great Recession, as you call it, and how Tega Cay and Fort Mill survived in regards to foreclosures in the rest of the state. How was the foreclosure rate in our area, Tega Cay, Fort Mill, in comparison to the rest of the state? Do you know that answer?
I don't know that offhand. Foreclosures were, South Carolina was hit hard in general in terms of foreclosures, but I can't comment on specifically for these two areas.
Okay. Well, thank you. This is great information, and one of the roles that we have as a council is to take in as much information as we possibly can so we can make an intelligent decision, and I think this is phenomenal, the information that you provided us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Jen?
Thank you for coming, and I also appreciate the Home Builders Association for paying for this. That's wonderful, too. So I thank them. The cost to serve is one of the major issues that residents have, so I'm glad that it's been discussed. And I love the quote, "People attract business and housing attracts people." I do believe that myself, and it shows it through the figures that you presented. Quality of life is another issue that a lot of people have with concerns of additional housing coming in and growth. And I'm not sure that that can really be quantitatively measured. However, indirectly, the financial stability of a household, as you were indicating, the spending increasing, it would be an indicator. Are there other quantitative measures that you can give for the quality of life? Not decreasing with housing increasing.
Quality of life, so there are a number of ways to address that. I think that we can look at it just from the perspective of attracting a workforce, attracting people to the region. Typically, we look at things as diverse as climate, as in general cost of living, in general various opportunities for whether it's recreation or job growth or a number of different. There are a number of different indicators there. It's hard to put a finger on, one or two things that are most important. But I would say there's a broad range of factors that we can look at. But beyond that, it's as you mentioned, it's hard to quantify some of them. But we see when companies come in, they typically talk about what their priorities are, and we see it reflected somewhat there because as they come in, they're concerned about their employees and attracting them for the long run. So they sometimes give us some insight there, but they're a broad array of measures that we can look at. I don't know that there are one or two in particular that I would necessarily focus on and say these are the most important.
Okay. And the third thing that I hear a lot from residents is housing price stability and current home values being negatively impacted by additional new homes coming in, that their house market would be going down. So I'd like just to look at your presentation because I'm just trying to understand where cause and effect, where the house price appreciation increases, yet under downside risk, you state less stable housing prices. Is that due to what you were discussing before for the inflated, false, inflation of a house? And are we going to be concerned about that because our housing prices are already so high?
I think that is a concern, yes. And when we look at, if we look at the path forward moving ahead, the phenomenon of getting back to putting all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, and if we see a community that's largely reliant on the Charlotte market, and we see house prices continuing to increase at significant rates, then when a recession comes, the demand is going to drop off significantly, and that is going to be an effect that is a result of that in the recession. So that is so the question becomes, to what extent is housing stability a priority, and how is that going to be affected based on whether or not a community is fully reliant on one region, one industry, or is it in diversifying the industry and in increasing the supply for housing, because that allows both a diversity of industry and it prevents these more artificially inflated housing prices. Does that help alleviate some of that risk? So that's really the trade-off there. And so, again, the question becomes, where's that right balance?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. When you were talking about, push the button. There. When you were talking about employment growth and jobs added per month, do you take into account the people that dropped out of the job market that same month?
That's an excellent question. Job growth does not account for. So you're talking about basically people dropping out of the labor force.
Yes, sir.
So when we're looking at employment numbers, we can look at employment growth, which is just the number of people who are obtaining jobs, and then if we look at the unemployment rate, that's going to factor in people who you're considered unemployed. Well, let me back up. You're considered in the labor force if you're either working or actively looking for work. And the way they establish that is they actually do a household survey, and they ask, I think the question is, have you worked in the last, or looked for work, I want to say it's 6 weeks, it's either 6 or 10 weeks. So if I call you and say, have you looked for work in the last 6 weeks, and you say yes, but I haven't found anything, you're counted as unemployed. If you say no, I haven't, because for whatever reason, then you are not considered unemployed, even if you are not working. So the labor force itself, while we track people who are looking for work, there are a number of people that did drop out of the labor force that are now coming back in, that by a broader measure of unemployment, we can get some perspective on whether they were unemployed. So in other words, if you got the standard labor force, which just measures people who are unemployed as those actively looking for work, these people that haven't been because they've dropped out of the labor force would not be considered unemployed. But there are broader measures of unemployment. So our current unemployment rate, right around 5.5%. But if we count all of these people that you're referring to, which are ones that have not reported having looked for work in the last 6 weeks or so, but only because they have given up and haven't been able to find any opportunities, that number is about twice the current unemployment rate of the state. So it's about twice as high. So we do capture that in that broader measure of unemployment. But when we just look at the employment growth numbers themselves, that's just counting people who are getting jobs and who are actually working. Does that make sense? That answer?
Yes, sir.
Get at what you're looking at?
Also, one of the things I think that brought on the Great Recession is that we were selling houses to people that could not afford them. And we did that by having zero interest rate and these variable rate mortgages. If I can't afford a house at 1% interest, how in the world am I going to afford a house at 5%? Is any of that going on now?
So to a lesser extent, well, so basically, so you're absolutely right. And the pendulum essentially has swung, at least temporarily, from one sort of extreme where anybody could get a loan to the other extreme. So for a while, restrictions were very high, and to a large extent, they had put in place more financial restrictions that were preventing a lot of that from happening. And they were also preventing builders from actually being able to go through and actually, they were seeing demand, but their buyers couldn't get qualified. So the pendulum had really swung. And I've talked to a number of builders who would say, we're seeing the demand, we have customers, but they're having trouble getting loans, even though they, in a more normal environment, would qualify for them. I think that's moving back more, maybe to a more middle ground. So to answer your question, I think for a while we had really swung almost too far in the opposite direction. Now we're moving back. Are a lot of these bad loans occurring? You know, I haven't seen the financial markets, specific loans and the mortgage business that closely to be able to answer that question solidly. But I would say that in the early part of as I mentioned, in the early part of the recovery, we were seeing much less of that, at least locally, anecdotally. But if that's changed now, I don't know. I can't comment.
Okay, I have one more comment. When we talk about growth, and nobody wants growth unless it's over yonder, we were discussing our Fort Mill Town Council annexing what at that time was known as the museum property. It's now the Mason's Bend property. And a lady stood up, and she was all upset because those trucks going up and down Highway 21 were going to destroy her quality of life. She lived in a place called Walden Park, and it backs up to Highway 21. And we had this lady at that time attended all of our meetings. She kept them lively. And she asked, she said, "How long have you lived in Fort Mill?" And she said, 2 years. And she said, "You're part of our blankety blank problem. Could you move in and want to close the gate behind you?" And I think a lot of people who are complaining about growth are themselves part of the growth problem. For whatever that's worth.
All right, great. Thank you for coming out, Dr. Von Nessen. It's been a pleasure. We definitely got informed at a higher level than we expected to, I believe. I just have one quick question. Have you done research or have some deeper information on the value or the importance of infrastructure in place prior to the growth of rooftops in an area and how it could be beneficial, or if it doesn't matter? Or, you know, that's one of the big arguments we have here in Tega Cay specifically is, hey, all these people want to come in, all these houses want to, you know, builders want to build. It's a great area to be. They're going to sell like hotcakes, but the traffic's going to be absolutely absurd. You know, bottlenecking, takes 90 minutes to drive 20 miles to work. Have you dealt with more in-depth studies, you know, at that macro level, that state level, that kind of discusses those types of issues when it comes to growth?
I'm familiar with some in general, but each locality is so different. Again, I think it's hard to generalize. I would say the only comment I would make from an infrastructure perspective is that it's an important component, and we see. I think that's true both for local communities and for industry when they're coming in, and any type of when you see development, infrastructure is a critically important component, and we see that just from a business perspective. They mention that all the time when they're coming to South Carolina or any of the local region. That's a major deciding factor. But again, looking at the local regions, it comes down to the specific numbers and how that is handled. It's an important process, and it's an important component of growth. But in terms of the cost structure and basically getting back to this question of does housing pay for itself, I think that's only something you can answer looking at the specific data in the local region.
Okay, well, thank you for coming out. Thanks, everybody, for taking the first, I don't want to say the first step. I'm kind of new here, but our council's coming together, talking about some issues and going in the right direction as far as for working together to do this the right way.
May I ask one additional question?
I have one.
You
Okay.
have one too.
So now we get to
Pick me,
do
pick
round
me.
two.
So,
Well, I'm going first.
All right.
All right?
Sure.
What happens to an area when housing stagnates or stops?
If So if housing is completely stopped, but you have continued industry growth, which is, I think, getting to the heart of your question, you are essentially going to get appreciation of home prices, because you're going to see an increasing demand coming from new industry growth. And that's kind of an example of that would be Charleston, where we've seen Charleston's a very diversified economy, and so we're continuing to see significant growth there. They've, as I showed you, one of the highest growth rates in the state. And because in Mount Pleasant in particular, they've seen a lot of restrictions on growth, and you've seen an increase in pricing. And if you look at the dramatic differences between communities like Somerville and Mount Pleasant, for example, you see some of the ramifications of that. So I think the most immediate effect is a significant change, a potential significant change in price appreciation.
Okay. Sure.
I'm going to ask that question in a different way.
Okay.
It goes,
Sure.
it goes
Do you want
back.
a different answer?
You-
Or?
yeah. It goes back to the question I ask. If you build rooftops, will business come? Let's ask it in the reverse. If you don't build rooftops, will businesses stop coming? The big issue in the room, all of us, it's about a moratorium.
Sure, yes.
Let's
And
just
I'm
go ahead.
aware of
I'm going to
that,
go ahead
yes,
and say
yes.
it. You know, that M word, we all have to think about it. And we all have to think about, when do you stop? When do you start? How do you go into it? How do you come out of it? And how do you accomplish what's required within the constraints of it? I think there's a lot of regulatory oversight to a moratorium that very few people know. And I think that that's really hard to determine, how do we manage growth without stopping the important growth that will provide jobs and will provide the tax base that we need for that infrastructure. So I'm putting the M word out there. If we did a moratorium and we stopped housing for a period of time, what is your experience and your knowledge of communities that have done that, and was it positive?
I think that what you have to keep in mind with any significant change in policy with regard to construction is how does that affect when you're looking at industry that's looking to come in, how does that affect the reputation of the local area? And what does that tell potential industry that's coming in? Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that the perception around in a local area around different policies, housing moratorium certainly being one among several, that is very important when industries are deciding whether to come to a local region. So I'd say that is an important factor to consider, but I can't say I can't say what that perception would be in the particular case, but that I would say is an important factor to be considering.
My question is in regards to something you said earlier about retirees coming to South Carolina and additional growth to our area compared to other areas of the country. Hello. I'm not scared of a microphone, I promise. So how does that relate to our area and what we should be looking at? When you talk about the economic side of it, that piece isn't a part of here, according to what you mentioned to Mr. Huntley. How would municipalities need to react in order to obtain more? You know, senior living coming. We've got a huge development in Sun City here being built right now. There's already one down the road. So we're already feeling that. How does that come into play with this presentation you gave us today?
I'd say it provides provides additional opportunities for local markets, because that's basically a niche market. People coming in who are retired. We're seeing a number of active senior citizen, whether that's communities or any type of recreational facilities. But there's going to continue to be a major market just for active adult seniors. Basically 55 plus, and that's only going to increase. And because South Carolina has such a positive quality of life, again, we attract a lot of military retirees. For all these reasons, we're going to see more people considering South Carolina for their retirement destination, and so that creates a new source of demand. And just to give you an example, if you look at just comparing housing prices across the country, what we're seeing a lot of examples throughout the state is you've got people who are in maybe Washington, D.C. or in New York or other areas up north, You know, when you look at the housing prices there, you know, if they finish a career, they can kind of cash in on those houses, and they may be living in a bungalow, and they can come live like a king down here because of the discrepancy in the different prices. So that is a whole new market, and people are recognizing that, not just in South Carolina, but in the South more generally. And because of the aging demographics, I think that provides opportunities, and how we want to capitalize on that, of course, depends, but it certainly provides additional sources of demand that is not as reliant on employment growth.
And so in doing that, that provides additional spending income coming in.
Definitely,
In
absolutely.
a different manner as well, and a
Correct.
lot of discretionary income coming
Yes,
in.
yes.
Yes. And it doesn't affect our schools. Yeah. Although hopefully they'll be volunteering, so. Your turn.
Speaking of housing prices, did you observe, as you were preparing your presentation tonight, the percentages of increase in housing in Tega Cay or Fort Mill, the area, year over year at all? Did you look at that at all? And if you did look at it, are the percentages of increase reasonable, realistic, whatever that means? Or is this sort of now runaway price increases and so forth that are going to come back to nip us in the butt later?
They're on the higher side of what we're seeing in South Carolina in general. I can't speak to the specific numbers. That's something I could get back to you on, but I can say they're on the higher side when we look at South Carolina as a whole.
Okay, because the concern, and I think it's something that Jen mentioned, is, you know, now, you know, a lot of the reason that people move to the South, many reasons, but one is, right, you sell the bungalow in D.C. and you buy a 6,200 square foot house in Tega Cay, at least I did. I went from 756 square feet to 6,200. But for how long? Right, are we going to price ourselves out of the market? Are we going to become, you know, a DC, a New York, a Philadelphia, if we continue to have the influx of people and there is more of a demand for the supply that we have at some point, and so forth and so on, that our prices are going to rise. So
Well, I think that's true generally. You know, I don't know that you point to an extreme example,
I know.
obviously, but you know, I think the logic there is true, that you will see an increasing demand over time that will continue to see house price appreciation. The question is how much will it end up being?
Yeah, I would be interested if you do have that information on sort of the percentage increase for housing prices.
Okay.
If you
Sure.
could provide that to Charlie, the city manager, or something, that would be interesting information to have.
Okay. Absolutely.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we'll talk about that afterwards.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you very much. You've confirmed for all of us that there is an exit on the Jersey Turnpike that if you take it, you wind up here. So we appreciate that. And we're going to echo something that Father John says over at St. Philip Neri: with the last person out of Jersey, please turn out the lights, because that's what's happening. If there are no other comments or anything else, I'll entertain a motion that we adjourn.
I'd just like to say a quick thank you to Tega Cay to inviting us to this side of 77 and to be a part of this, because we are all in this together. It is one township that needs to continue working together to build and to grow in a positive manner. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming, and we'll come over to your side anytime.
Don't forget to get your passport stamped on your way over.
Yeah.
And for what it's worth, I am a Tega Cay native, so.
Dr. Von Nessen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
all
Really
very much.
appreciate it.
We're adjourned.